we should get pretty close to finishing up this chapter today. Let's just review the nodal system quickly. This here is the SA node right here. That's the one that has the intrinsic rate of 100 beats a minute. And then it sends its depolarization wave all throughout the atria, also down to the AV node. And the AV node puts a delay on transmitting the rate to the bundle of His and then all down the bundle branches and to the rest of the heart by 0.1 second so that the atria can complete their contraction. And that if there was damage to the SA node, then the AV node has an inherent rate of about 50 beats a minute, plus or minus 40 for some, 60 for others, but about 50 beats a minute. Then the AV node will send the rate down the bundle of His or the AV bundle, which then branches about mid-interventricular septum into the right and left bundle branches, servicing those ventricles. And then they come out along the exterior of the ventricles and will finally terminate with the Purkinje fibers, which is the end of the nodal system. And the AV bundle and Purkinje fibers and anything in between has an intrinsic or inherent rate of 30 beats a minute. So the heart is wired to beat. Everything in that system will propagate an action potential. Now, the thing that you should appreciate, though, is remember when you depolarize, you depolarize a muscle, just like you depolarize a neuron, it's going to cause that muscle to contract. And take a look at where the contraction wave starts. It starts at the base of the interventricular septum and then goes to the apex. So what that means is that the interventricular septum shortens before the rest of the ventricular wall actually contracts. And so that's another reason why you have that apex going up towards the semilunars and AV valves in the heart and have that twisting action there. So following that depolarization wave helps to explain some of the interesting contraction phenomenon that you see with the heart. The nodal system is the intrinsic conduction system, and there is an intrinsic conduction system that occurs with the heart, or intrinsic aspect on the heartbeat itself. And one is the cardioaccelerator center, and the other is the cardioinhibitory center. They're both housed in the medulla oblongata, which is the base of our brain stem. And the accelerator center obviously increases the heart rate, and that is going to be because of sympathetic influence. The inhibitory center is going to decrease the heart rate, and that's a parasympathetic influence process. In lab, you are going to be doing ECGs. That stands for electrocardiogram. Somebody asked why was it called the EKG, and actually the EKG, and now our ECG, was actually created by the Germans, and RDO is the German way of spelling it, and it was a much more abrasive pronunciation. That's the way the Germans are. It works for them. Yeah. So it is a graphical recording of the electrical activity of the heart. So it's of depolarizations and repolarizations is what it's actually telling you, because that's what the electrical activity of the heart is, the nodal system as well as the heart muscle cells themselves, because we took a look at heart muscle depolarization and repolarization when it looked kind of blocky. This is measured at the surface of the body, obviously not at the surface of the heart, and so therefore the programs actually subtract out the other electrical activity that is actually going on, because skeletal muscle has electrical activity, and also when you breathe and things along that line, the programs do help to actually subtract that, but it's only subtracting what I call basal or baseline electrical activity. And so if somebody's moving a lot, that will cause interference on the recording of the ECG. So we always ask the individual to lay still so that we don't have anything confusing our readings. So we measure it at the surface of the body, and we account for that in the ECG itself. And the ECG is designed to detect just conduction system problems, because remember, it's electrical activity of the heart, and damaged heart muscle. And the reason it can tell us about some damage to the heart muscle is because the heart muscle is also electrical. And if we have damage to that heart muscle cell, it will obviously, such as if it's dead, it will not contribute to the electrical waves or vectors that we've determined to be the proper ECG recording of the heart. The ECG recording will show you a P wave, an R wave, and a T wave. So those are the names that we give the waves. The P wave is atrial depolarization. The R wave, which is often referred to as the QRS complex, is ventricular depolarization. And then our T wave is ventricular repolarization. So if you hear R wave, realize when somebody's saying R wave, they are referring to the QRS complex. We don't see atrial repolarization in this listing, correct? And that is because the atrial repolarization is occurring at the same time as the ventricular depolarization is occurring. And so our QRS complex is actually hiding what would be the atrial repolarization. Now, it's based upon vectors, and so what you have to understand is the upward deflection is telling you that this electrical activity is following a vector that starts in the upper right quadrant and goes down to the lower left quadrant. And so as long as that electrical activity is following in that direction, you have your upward wave deflections. The other thing that you take a look at this is which wave is the narrowest. The R wave is the narrowest. Yet, what is the heart muscle mostly? It is ventricular, is it not? And so what's really fascinating is that the R wave is the narrowest, which means that the depolarization wave is the fastest in our ventricles. Yet we have so much distance to travel, so to speak, with our depolarization wave. And that also tells you that ventricular depolarization is more efficient than atrial depolarization. And so there are, even in heart muscle cells, there are actually different areas that do a better job in that conduction of depolarization and repolarization. So ventricular depolarization is very efficient, very fast, and that's why we have a narrow QRS complex. Also, this large upward deflection does tell you quite a bit about the size of the ventricles themselves, and so that upward deflection is a bit reflective of the ventricular mass also. So that's the basis of the ECG. There are times when we see segments, and you'll go over a little bit of that in lab this week. But they are all related to the preceding wave that you see before them. Cardiac cycle is what we term everything that happens during one heartbeat, and a lot of things happen during that one love dub, and that's what we're referring to. Terminology here, diastole is referred to as relaxation of the heart muscle, and systole is contraction of the heart muscle. Which one of those two would be related to the electrical activity of depolarization? Systole. So we'll depolarization. So they're closely connected here. And then diastole would be related to our repolarization. Because without depolarization, you don't get systole, and without repolarization, you will not get diastole. Blood flow is just like diffusion. We will have fluid move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So in diffusion, remember, an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Same principles actually apply here. Let's take a look at ventricular filling. We have in this area here atrial contraction and ventricular filling. It's important for you to realize that the bulk of ventricular filling is actually passive. When we get to the end of this, we'll be able to actually see what I mean by it's actually passive. But let's start here with atrial contraction and ventricular filling. Look at this. It is starting in mid to late diastole. And that makes sense. When we talk about some terms, diastole and systole, I want you to understand that atria have diastole and systole, and so do ventricles. But if I do not specify the chamber that we're talking about, we're going to be talking about ventricles because ventricles make up the bulk of the heart. So if I want to talk about atrial diastole or systole, I will say the word atrial. But if I just say generic diastole or systole, then I'm wanting you to realize that we're talking about ventricular diastole and systole. So atrial contraction and ventricular filling, mid to late diastole, that's a ventricular event. So the ventricles are relaxed. They are allowing blood to flow into them, but here in mid to late diastole, because you would think that you would get blood in before this time, and you do, in mid to late, we get atrial contraction to occur. Now, the atria, as you guys know from taking a look at your hearts, your pig hearts, they aren't muscular chambers. The only area of the atria that's actually muscular are the little auricles. And so when we talk about atrial contraction, we're typically talking about auricular contraction. And so they're almost like a shelf or a little pocket. And so when the auricles contract, that little bit of blood that's in there, they will push into the ventricles, area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Our notes here say ventricles relaxed, yes. Atria contract, which means that atria are obviously going into systole when they do that. And it's going to be the auricles that are actually contracting. And blood is going to flow from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So high P is in the atria, low P is in the ventricles. The AV valves during this time period, they're going to be open. And at the end of atrial contraction and the end of ventricular filling, we will have an end diastolic volume of only 130 cc's or mLs. That's a little over 4 ounces of blood. Will be in either ventricle. We've already discussed both ventricles have to fill the same amount because we can't have one shorter than the other, otherwise it will impact the other pump later on. Now the ventricles are going to go into systole, and so that means they're going to go ahead and contract. And as they go into systole, yep, makes sense, the atria go into diastole, they're relaxing. And as those ventricles contract, that intraventricular pressure of that blood that's inside is going to rise rapidly. And when this happens, this rapid rise of pressure, we need to close our AV valves, correct? Otherwise, blood will flow into the atria. So they're going to close because the blood's going to get behind the little flaps and it's going to push them out, and instead of up against the wall, it's going to push them out, and also our papillary muscles are going to start to shorten as the ventricular wall starts to come on up towards our valves. So the AV valves are going to close. That will ensure we don't get backflow, and we're going to go through a period called isovolumetric contraction. Isovolumetric means same volume. So we have this volume inside, kind of like a water balloon. You have a water balloon in your hand, and you've tied off the top, and now we're going to squeeze it harder and harder. So the pressure inside the ventricle chamber on the blood is going to increase. And the harder you squeeze, the higher the pressure. Same process here. But isovolumetric means what other valves are closed? Semilunar. So AVs and semilunars are closed. So all valves closed. Because if you didn't have all the valves closed, you would get blood to flow out whenever the pressure got higher in that chamber versus the other area that it was actually flowing to. With isovolumetric contraction, that pressure is rising because we're going to squeeze harder and harder, and then we will get ventricular ejection, and the blood will move from the ventricles into the arteries, aorta for the left, pulmonary trunk for the right. And it does so because now intraventricular pressure is greater than our arterial pressure. And I'm going to put back pressure. Because one of the things that you have to realize, this is a closed system, and there is fluid, i.e. blood, in every area of this system. So if there is blood in a vessel, it's going to exert pressure inside that vessel, correct? And so when let's stick with the left ventricle, when the left ventricle contracts, it's pressure and we have all our valves closed. The reason that the aortic semilunar valves are closed is because there's blood weighing on those valves. You guys follow me with that? So there's blood in the aorta, and even though, I will go into it a little bit more, but trust me, there's still blood in the aorta, and so when the ventricles contract, finally their pressure gets great enough to where it can push the aortic semilunar valves against the wall of the aorta, because that pressure inside the ventricle is now greater than the back pressure or the fluid remaining in our aorta. So whoosh, we get a large ejection of a large volume of blood. What's interesting is the ejection of that blood is not as large as you think, because at the end of ejection, which is end systolic volume, we have 60 cc's or mLs left in the ventricle. So that ventricular ejection is actually only pushing out about 70 cc's or mLs of blood. So now interventricular pressure greater than arterial pressure, back pressure. So valves, which are the semilunars, open, and bolus of blood ejected. What do we know about the AV valves? They're still closed, otherwise we would have backflow during this time. So now we've ejected this volume of blood, and that's the end of systole. And now we go into diastole. And when we go into diastole, we're going to relax, and the pressure on that bit of blood that's still in the ventricle will rapidly decline, because the ventricles will rapidly relax. Just like they rapidly contract, they will rapidly relax. And when they do this, when the pressure starts to get less in the ventricles than it is in the aorta, then what do you know is going to happen? The blood wants to flow into the ventricles from the aorta, correct? But it cannot do so because of the semilunar valves. And so as the pressure in the aorta is greater now than the ventricles, the blood wants to fall back, so to speak, into the heart. But it cannot do that because the semilunar valves, by that very mechanism of coming back, just close, and then the blood literally bounces off, and is another reason why we get forward movement of our blood flow itself. So semilunars snap shut and prevent backflow of blood. Because remember, wants to go from high pressure to low pressure. Semilunars are now shut, and our AV valves are still shut because we go through a very short but real time of isovolumetric relaxation. So all valves closed here. This is not a very long time frame, but it does happen for a minuscule of a second. We have all valves closed as the ventricles are further going into their rapid pressure drop of diastole. Not long after they're going into this rapid pressure drop where all valves are closed, the pressure inside the ventricles becomes less than the pressure inside the atria. And when that pressure in the ventricle does become less than the pressure in the atria, the AV valves will also be forced open because the pressure will also push them open. And plus, remember, we're actually having a change on our tension of the chordae tendineae during this time period. So isovolumetric relaxation occurs, all valves closed, very short period of time. And then when intraventricular pressure becomes less than our atrial pressure, and that's intraatrial pressure, AV valves open and blood fills ventricle. This is still the very early part of our diastole, but we do have to go through a phase of isovolumetric relaxation before we actually start to fill the ventricles. And as this is occurring, this is what I was trying to tell you guys earlier. The bulk of ventricular filling is passive. This is that passive time right down here. The bulk of ventricular filling is passive. This is very important because this is why people who have atrial fibrillation do not need to have their heart rate adjusted by any sort of a pacer if they have a pretty good heart rate still going for them, because ventricular filling is predominantly passive. And so when the atria are wiggling and not actually ejecting blood at the end of ventricular diastole, it's not a big deal because the bulk of the blood is actually coming in anyway. The atria are just like a little turbo boost, so to speak, to the ventricular volume. And the only thing that we need to do for people who are in atrial fibrillation is give them a certain kind of medication, because blood is not designed to pool any place for any certain period of time. And so people with atrial fibrillation typically get, blood thinners, or more properly, anticoagulants. But the generic term is blood thinners, correct? And so people will say, yeah, I'm on blood thinners, I'm on Coumadin or warfarin and an aspirin or something along that line, because the little ledge, that little auricle, you guys can see that blood can get into that area, and if you're not kicking it out, it will pool there and it will eventually start to clot. And so that's why people with AFib, people are worried about blood clots for them. It's because of their atria not functioning properly. Quiescent period is the time in between cycles. And so let's talk about lubbed up, and try not to look at your notes. Just let's think this one through. Because I'm going to tell you that the heart sounds are like teenagers that are mad at you. And when they're mad at you, they love to slam doors. And that's what the heart sounds are. The heart sounds are valve closures. You know, you never really hear a door open unless it hits the wall, right? So you don't hear a door open, but you sure do hear doors close, especially when they're closed with force, which is what we do with our AVs and our semilunar valves. We close those valves with force, and that's what you actually hear with lubbed up. So with that in mind, which one is the first heart sound? In other words, which valves close first? AV valves. So see, you guys are good with this. And then, so therefore, DUP is our semilunar valves. So S1, AV valves, S2, semilunars. So first heart sound, AVs, second heart sound, semilunars. Now my question to you about this now is, which is longer? Now that we've talked about this and talked about valve closure and all the mechanisms of heart filling and relaxation and contraction and all that stuff, which part is longer, systole or diastole? Which part of our heart cycle is longer, systole or diastole? Diastole. So lub dub is literally the time frame of systole. And dub lup is diastole, right? Isn't it always lubbed up, pause, lubbed up, pause? The pause is there so that your heart can fill properly, because remember, the bulk of heart filling is passive. And so that lubbed up that you hear, what you're actually hearing is, and paying attention to, is a systolic event, correct? The closure of the doors is a systolic event. And then the opening of the doors or the valves is that diastole, which is the longer time for for filling of your ventricles. So that makes sense. Let's go to the topic of cardiac output. There's nobody in the ICU or CCU that doesn't have cardiac output measured. And so they're very interested in how well their pump is working. And so cardiac output is something that's been followed for a long time in the health of a heart. It is the amount of blood pumped by a ventricle in 1 minute. And both ventricles pump the same amount. So it doesn't matter whether we're measuring right or left. If you measure left, that should be what the right is. If you measure right, that should also be what the left is. We have a term here called stroke volume, or SV. Stroke volume equals the amount of blood pumped by one ventricle in one beat. And so it is EDV, end diastolic volume, minus ESV, end systolic volume. End diastolic volume is at the end of relaxation, which should be when you are the most full, correct? And end systolic volume would be the volume of blood left over after you've ejected this. And so end diastolic volume will always be a larger number, and end systolic volume will always be a smaller number. Because if it isn't, we have a lot of heart problems going on. So that's stroke volume. So now that we have that definition, let's go ahead and talk about CO, or cardiac output. CO is our abbreviation for cardiac output, not carbon monoxide, equals stroke volume times heart rate. And so our stroke volume, as we mentioned earlier, is 70 cc's or mLs per beat, and heart rate in an average person, we'll go ahead and say, is 75 beats per minute. So that ends up with a cardiac output being around 5.25 liters per minute. What's the average blood volume of a man? Yeah, this is it. So your heart can literally pump you dry in 1 minute. And so that is one reason why, when there's compromise of a large vessel, you won't depend upon the coagulation system to save your life, because the large vessel cannot actually have that much vasoconstriction against the pressure that's behind it. When I talk about large vessel, I'm talking about somebody losing a limb, correct? Because that would be considered a large vessel. And so that's why we apply tourniquets as quickly as we can, because already before we've applied a tourniquet, they have already started to pump out a large amount of their blood volume. And in order to save their lives, we need to apply a tourniquet ASAP for them. Ventricular balance, this is to remind you guys that the equal amount of blood is pumped by each ventricle. If this wasn't true, we'll end up with edema along the way. So if the left pump is not ejecting is not, if whatever is happening to where the left pump is not properly allowing the proper volume of blood out into the systemic circuit, that means we're getting a backup of pressure along the way. You guys follow that? If we're not pumping out our 70 cc's every time, we're pumping out less, that means that we're still getting filled up from the other side, correct? If you're still getting filled up from the other side and you're not emptying, that pressure is going to increase all the way and be felt at the most vulnerable structures, which are your capillaries. They can't handle high pressures. And so capillaries leak, that causes pulmonary edema, and that can be heard by listening to the lungs or the chest. And then if the right pump is not ejecting blood properly to the lungs, that means then the right pump is filling up too much, which means that the IVC and the SVC pressure is rising, and that means the capillary beds of your extremities, more prominently your feet, will be leaking, and then you'll have edema of those areas. So you can see what happens with right pump failure and left pump failure, and then you can have both fail. And that's typically called congestive heart failure, where you actually see leg edema and you hear edema or rales, crackles in the lungs. Regulation of the heart rate. Autonomic nervous system is the big player in that extrinsic aspect. Remember, the medulla oblongata has got the cardio accelerator and cardio decelerator centers in them. And where's our ANS control centers located? Hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus will tell the medulla oblongata, go ahead, speed it up, go ahead, slow it on down. So don't forget that. Sympathetic and parasympathetic. The medulla, the hypothalamus is a big player in actually controlling other regulatory centers in the brain. The sympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. That's released at the SA node. Epinephrine can do the same thing. It will cause an increase in the depolarizations. And it does this by causing increased sodium leakage. The leakier you are, the more sharp the upward curve for threshold, and that increases our depolarization rate. And so therefore heart rate rises. Parasympathetic nervous system. Neurotransmitter is acetylcholine still on our end organs or receptors. And acetylcholine is interesting because it will cause an opening of potassium gates. If you, just at baseline, if you open up potassium gates, if you're at baseline, which direction are you going to go? Are you going to go up or are you going to go down? You go down, you hyperpolarize. And that's how this one works. This hyperpolarizes a cell, therefore causing a slowness in the depolarization. You guys follow me with that? So when we open up our potassium gates, this hyperpolarizes. And therefore slowing down our depolarization rate. And decreasing your heart rate. Sodium, more leaky, faster heart rate. Potassium, open gates, slows down the heart rate. Vagal tone, well, remember the vagus is cranial nerve 10. And we are in parasympathetic dominance. And the vagus is the nerve that leaves the skull and wanders around. That's what the vagabond is all about. And wanders around and gives parasympathetic innervation to our organs to actually allow us to have that resting activity that actually occurs. And so it is the vagus nerve that keeps our heart rate at between 70 and 80 beats per minute. What happens if we cut the vagus nerve? Heart rate goes up because we've lost that vagal tone. Now, we have how many vagus nerves? 2. So if we cut one, we still have the other, still sending information to that vagus because we have these cardiac plexus of the vagus nerve. They come together and stuff. So you'd have to cut the vagus nerves, both of them above the cardiac plexus, in order to actually cause that heart rate to go up. But that's what keeps our heart rate where it is. And the slower your heart rate, your vagus nerve is saying, well, your resting basal is slower than everybody else's. And the reason your heart rate is slower than everybody else's is usually you're athletic, right? And what you've done is you've trained your heart muscle, just like you train your other muscles, to be better muscles and more efficient. So therefore, the volume that you eject in one stroke volume is going to be more than 70 beats a minute. So therefore, do you need as much heart rate to keep your body happy? And so that's why athletes have a lower heart rate. They have a lower heart rate because their heart muscle is better at ejecting the volume of blood that's actually in it. We have some receptors that we need to talk about that will also impact our heart rate. They're called baroreceptors or pressoreceptors. So they sense pressure changes. And it's going to give information to the brain about the pressures in various areas of the body. So we have carotid sinus, aortic bodies, and atrial reflex. So that's where our pressure receptors are. In the carotid sinus, which happens to be kind of at the angle of the jaw, the big vessel in your neck that is responsible for taking the bulk of blood to your brain is called the common carotids. Once it gets up here to your skull, then it bifurcates or branches. One of them is going to go inside the skull to feed the brain, and the other is going to go and actually service things external to your brain. So we call them then, this was called common carotid. So the one to the outer aspect is the external carotid, and the one to the inner aspect is the internal carotid. So this carotid sinus is located in the neck, it says, but I'm talking about high neck. I'm talking where that area for the sinus, where that branching actually occurs. Because the brain is more interested in its blood flow. So this is going to be more associated with the side that's going to the brain itself, so that internal carotid. So if you have, let's think about that. If we increase the P in the carotid sinus, what does it tell the brain about its blood flow? What do you think? We're going to have a whole bunch of blood flowing to the brain, correct? So the brain is really, you know, those of you that have picky eaters around the house, how they kind of control your eating for everybody else. Well, the brain is as picky as anybody gets as far as control of the body. And the brain wants a very specific volume of blood flowing to it. It's typically about 750 cc's, but don't worry about that right now. But it says, I only want this volume of blood flowing to me. And if you send more to it, what will the brain tell your body to do? Slow it down. And so when we increase the pressure in the carotid sinus, this will decrease your heart rate right off the bat. Because that's the easiest one to control, right? It's easier to control heart rate than it is to control contractility of the heart muscle itself, and it's the quickest. So if we increase pressure in the carotid sinus, we will decrease the heart rate. Well, what if we decrease pressure in the carotid sinus? That means I'm not getting enough blood flow to me, and I'm going to tell you, you better increase that heart rate. Our notes here say the aortic bodies are similar to the carotid bodies. And so if we're sending out too much blood, the heart rate will slow down. If we're not sending out enough blood, the heart rate will speed up. So that's what we're referring to there. These two baroreceptors are very important, and we get a little bit of a failure of their functioning as we age. And we call that failure of their functioning a very specific name because it's to do with blood pressure. Has anybody ever heard of orthostatic hypotension? And so this is very important because think about this. So we have a certain amount of effort to push blood to our brain superiorly as we're standing, correct? Well, what do we know? As soon as we lay down, what does our heart rate do? It drops, doesn't it? Because suddenly we're not fighting gravity, and so that large effort that we were using to squeeze blood up to our head, we don't need to have that much of an effort now that we've actually changed gravity on us, correct? So then as we stand up, so we're laying down, so our heart rate's down, correct? And then when we stand up, what should our heart rate do? It should go up. And what happens in people with orthostatic hypotension, their baroreceptors are slow. And if you have slow baroreceptors going to your head, you have decreased blood flow. And when you have decreased blood flow to your brain, what will you do? You fall down because you're not getting enough perfusion, and your brain says, okay, we're just going to lay down again. And you will lay down, and then you will get good perfusion back to your brain. So that's orthostatic hypotension. So we have failure of the more important one here, the carotid sinus, and we have a bit of a backup system here, don't we, with our aortic bodies? So it's designed as a backup system, but sometimes it doesn't work fast enough for us. Then the atria, yes?
So that's why when you like jump up out of bed really quick, you like a head rush.
Yeah, when you jump up out of bed early, really quickly, and you have that head rush, it's either you're getting a sudden big bolus of blood to your head or you're not. It's one or the other. So now let's go to the atrial reflex. Well, remember I said our baroreceptors are in these areas. So these are in our atria. Okay, and we have one of our atria is very well wired, correct? Which atria is the most wired? Our right atrium. Well, we also have in that right atrium this atrial reflex pattern that some guy named Bainbridge obviously identified. So now let's talk about what we want to do if our atria are being over-distended. If our atria are being over-distended, is that a good thing? No, it's not. So we want the atria to, which is easier, to empty the atria or to stop the backup system? Empty the atria. And if you want to empty the atria, what will you do to the heart rate? Will you slow the heart rate or will you increase the heart rate if you want the atria to empty? Increase the heart rate. And that's what the Bainbridge reflex is actually all about. So as long as you remember over distension, and then what's the easiest way to handle the pressure of this over distension, then you'll actually be able to figure out whether it slows your heart rate or speeds your heart rate up. So this is a sympathetic reflex. Its receptors are located at entry points in the atria, so therefore SVC and IVC. Increased pressure is equal to over distension. We need to empty. And therefore, we will increase the heart rate in order to actually do this. It decreases congestion or too much blood in one area of the heart. And this atrial reflex impacts our SA node. So we get an sympathetic nervous system will stimulate the SA node to actually increase the heart rate. Chemicals that will also impact our heart rate and cardiac output and things along that line are hormones and ions. Hormones should make sense. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, that's typically what we refer to adrenaline, but that's also the neurotransmitters of the sympathetic nervous system, so increased heart rate. And then thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is our major metabolic hormone, and it will also up your heart rate. So make the heart act more in keeping with an increased metabolic rate. So increases heart rate as well as force of contractions. All of those will do that. So think about the ionic needs of the nodal system of the heart, and now tell me what ions we need to have in proper balance in order for the heart to actually beat properly. Sodium, potassium, always, and calcium. We have to have the proper balance of these ions in order for things to function at the cellular level. And so whenever they check your electrolytes or do a blood test, guess which ones they're always checking? Sodium, potassium, and if it's cardiac and some other things, they'll always be checking your calcium too, because those levels are very important for normal cardiac function. So I think we'll stop there, and next time we get together, we'll talk about vessels and circulation. And we've kind of already touched on that. So we'll do some clickers.